Good evening, friends. Tonight, I want to share with you a story that's as real as the faith we hold in our hearts, a tale of darkness that invaded a simple home in Texas, reminding us all of the spiritual battles that rage unseen. Before we dive in, just a quick note. The names of the people involved here have been changed at random to make it easier for you to follow along. The real identities are protected out of respect for those who've suffered. It all began on a sweltering August night back in 2008, right there in Fort Worth, Texas, a bustling city with its suburban neighborhoods and strong Baptist communities stretching out under the big Texas sky. The local police got an emergency call from some concerned neighbors about screams and crashing sounds coming from a modest little house on Hemphill Street. When the officers burst through the door, what they found chilled them to the bone. The lifeless body of a 13-month-old baby girl named Amora Johnson, lying motionless in the bathtub. Her tiny frame was covered in bruises, cuts, blood, and what looked like bite marks. It was a scene no one should ever have to witness. Sitting there sobbing beside her was her mother, Jessica Johnson, a 25-year-old bartender from a local spot, someone who'd struggled with substance abuse in her past. She was muttering something incoherent about demons or evil spirits. And then there was her boyfriend, Blaine Miller, 28, a construction worker with a troubling criminal record involving sexual offenses from back in 2005. He was arrested right on the spot, his hands stained with blood, and he kept insisting that he was just trying to exorcise the child that Amora had been possessed by a demon. Can you imagine? In the heat of that moment, it sounded like the ravings of a guilty man. But as I've learned in my years as a priest and exorcist, sometimes the line between human evil and something far darker blurs in ways we can't ignore. The case grabbed headlines fast. Local news like KDFW, Fox 4 was all over it. Witnesses from the neighborhood started coming forward, talking about strange growling noises echoing from that house for weeks beforehand. It wasn't just a one-off thing. It built up like a storm gathering on the horizon. As the investigation unfolded, folks began piecing together the history of that place. Turns out the house hadn't always belonged to Jessica and Blaine. Back in the 1990s, it was owned by a woman we'll call Rita Hale, a troubled soul who dabbled in black magic, the kind of occult practices that open doors best left shut. Rita wasn't just curious, she was deep into it, summoning entities from ancient grimoires like the Goetia. And the one she called upon, Astaroth, described in those old texts as a duke of hell, a fallen angel cast out for twisting forbidden knowledge, spreading sloth and madness among scholars in 16th century Europe, driving them to mass suicides to hide their secrets. Rita, in her desperation, had performed a ritual, sacrificing an animal to bargain for hidden truths. But Astaroth doesn't give without taking. It turned on her, forcing her into a self-immolation in 1998. Her story was whispered in occult circles, but for most, it was forgotten until Jessica moved in. You see, while cleaning out the garage one day, Jessica stumbled upon an old, dusty book tucked away in a corner. Curiosity got the better of her, as it often does. She flipped it open and, without realizing the danger, read aloud a passage, incantation that cracked open that spiritual doorway Rita had sealed with her life. From that moment, things started to shift, subtle at first, like a whisper in the wind. Amora, that sweet little 13-month-old who had been such a quiet, content baby, began acting out in ways no toddler should. It started early in 2008 with unusual crying fits, not the normal wails of hunger or tiredness, but deep, guttural sounds that didn't belong in a child's throat. Jessica brushed it off at first, thinking it was just the stresses of motherhood catching up, especially with her history. But then the whispers came, faint voices in the garage, murmuring in what sounded like ancient Latin, repeating the name Astaroth over and over. And with those whispers came stories, fragments of this entity's dark past, how it had manipulated alchemists in 17th century Germany, filling their minds with forbidden formulas that drove them mad, leading to suicides that erased their discoveries from history. Jessica told herself it was hallucinations, maybe from lack of sleep or old habits creeping back. But denial only goes so far. Soon, objects in the house began to move on their own, not gently, but violently. A bottle of milk flew across the kitchen, shattering against the wall. Lights exploded without warning, sending shards of glass flying. One time, a bulb burst right above Jessica, slicing her hand deep enough that she needed 5 stitches at John Peter Smith Hospital. The doctors there chalked it up to an accident, but Jessica knew better. She felt a presence, cold and calculating, watching her. And poor Amora, she became the focal point. The seizures started, her eyes bulging, body convulsing in ways that defied medical explanation. During one episode, she spoke not in baby babble, but in a deep masculine voice that echoed through the room, "I am Astaroth, the giver of deadly knowledge." It was enough to terrify anyone. Blaine, with his own dark past making him vulnerable, convinced Jessica this was demonic possession. He took it upon himself to drive it out, but his methods were brutal, beating the child under the guise of ritual, which only seemed to feed the entity, making everything worse. As the weeks turned into months, the evil escalated. One night, Astaroth manifested more fully through Amora, using her tiny voice to recount how it had twisted Rita Hale's life, forcing her to sacrifice her own son with a knife to conceal the rituals, binding her soul to strengthen its hold. Blaine, influenced by this growing darkness, turned on Jessica in a fit of irrational jealousy, punching her so hard he broke her jaw. What started as a supportive relationship crumbled into outright abuse, all under the shadow of this ancient demon. By late 2008, the house felt like a gateway to hell itself, flooded with forbidden knowledge that twisted minds. Amora's fits weren't just physical anymore. They triggered hallucinations, books levitating, bloody words scrawling across walls, sudden heat spikes that blistered skin. Jessica tried to hold her daughter once during a flare-up and ended up with second-degree burns on her arms, the kind that leave scars for life. The neighbors couldn't ignore it anymore. One woman, Sophie Ramirez, a 35-year-old nurse at the local hospital, a good, kind soul, peeked through her window one evening and saw things that haunted her. She started having visions herself, driven to self-harm, slashing her wrists in a daze. She lost so much blood she nearly died, only saved by quick medical intervention. Jessica, desperate and alone, reached out for help. She contacted Father Michael Rossi, a 52-year-old Catholic priest from Street, Andrew's Church in Fort Worth, a man with experience in exorcisms from the 1990s, and alongside him, Dr. Elena Vargas, a 48-year-old psychiatrist at Texas Health Harris Methodist, someone who bridged faith and science. They dove into the case urgently, confirming through research that Astaroth was no myth, a real demonic force with a history of inciting madness epidemics in 18th century European monasteries, manipulating knowledge to shatter souls. But while they prepared, the evil peaked dramatically. Astaroth, through Amora, lashed out at Blaine, causing him to fall from a ladder, fracturing his spine and causing internal injuries that left him bedridden. And then there was Victor Hale, a 42-year-old acquaintance of Blaine's, a drug dealer with his own sins. He got pulled in, possessed, storming the house with a gun and shooting Sophie in the leg, a wound that bled profusely. This was just the beginning of the nightmare, friends. As we move deeper into this account, you'll see how the battle intensified, revealing twists that test the very limits of faith and reason. Remember, in these stories, the devil seeks to sow doubt, but God's power is always greater. Stay with me as we uncover more. Now, as the shadows deepened in that Fort Worth home, the true horror began to unfold in ways that no one could have anticipated. With Father Rossi and Dr. Vargas stepping in, they approached the situation with a blend of spiritual wisdom and clinical insight, something I've always advocated for in these cases, where the mind and soul intertwine. They didn't rush in blindly. No, they started with interviews, poring over Jessica's accounts, examining the strange occurrences, and cross-referencing them with historical records of demonic entities. Astaroth, as they confirmed through ancient texts and church archives, wasn't just a name from dusty books. This was a being with a long trail of destruction, one that had sown seeds of insanity in the hearts of the faithful centuries ago. Picture this: Father Rossi, a seasoned priest with lines etched deep from years of facing the unseen, sat down with Jessica in the dim light of her living room. The air was thick, almost oppressive, as if the walls themselves were listening. Jessica recounted how the whispers had evolved into full-blown voices, echoing tales of Astaroth's manipulations in those old European monasteries, how it would whisper forbidden insights to monks during their studies, twisting their pursuit of knowledge into paranoia, leading entire communities to acts of self-destruction under the guise of divine revelation. Dr. Vargas, ever the skeptic, tempered by experience, ran tests on Amora, ruling out epilepsy or other neurological issues, but what she saw in those EEG readings defied explanation. Spikes of activity that synced with the child's unnatural utterances. But evil doesn't wait for investigations to wrap up neatly. While they planned their next steps, Astaroth struck with renewed fury, as if sensing the threat. One evening, as Jessica tried to feed Amora, the room heated up like a furnace, temperatures soaring without warning, blistering the skin on Jessica's arms as she reached for her daughter. It was no illusion. The burns were real, second degree, sending her back to the hospital where doctors puzzled over the cause. And Amora? Her convulsions grew more violent, her tiny body arching in impossible ways, eyes rolling back to show only whites. Through her lips came more revelations, stories of how Astaroth had fallen from grace, expelled from heaven for daring to share God's secrets with humanity, fueling the fires of the Renaissance's darkest corners, where scholars hanged themselves to silence the voices in their heads. Blaine, still recovering from his fall, became a pawn in this escalating game. Confined to his bed with a fractured spine, he started experiencing visions, nightmares, where Astaroth taunted him with his past sins, amplifying his guilt until he lashed out verbally at Jessica, accusing her of inviting the demon through her weakness. It was heartbreaking to hear later. A man already broken, now twisted further by an entity that fed on vulnerability. And Victor Hale, that troubled acquaintance pulled into the fray, he didn't just show up with a gun out of nowhere. No, it built up. Whispers reached him too, drawing him like a moth to flame. He confessed later in police custody that he'd been having dreams of buried secrets under the garage, urges to protect the house by any means. That night he burst in, firing at Sophie. It wasn't random rage, it was orchestrated, the bullet grazing her leg and causing a gush of blood that soaked the floorboards. Sophie, bless her, that compassionate nurse, screamed not just in pain but in terror, claiming she saw shadowy figures dancing in the corners of her vision. As the team regrouped, Father Rossi praying fervently, Dr. Vargas coordinating medical support, the decision was made to move forward with the exorcism, but not in the house. Too risky, they said. The entity was too entrenched there, feeding off the residual energy from Rita's old rituals. Instead, they chose an abandoned church on the outskirts of Fort Worth, a place long forgotten but still consecrated ground, to isolate the demon and prevent it from spreading its influence to the city. It was a strategic choice, one that echoed the caution I've emphasized in my own work: contain the battle, protect the innocent. The ritual began in early January 2009 under a cold Texas moon that seemed to watch indifferently. Father Rossi led the charge, armed with holy water, a crucifix forged from blessed silver, and passages from the Bible that have stood against darkness for millennia. Dr. Vargas and Sophie, despite her wound bandaged and throbbing, stood by as witnesses and aides, ready to intervene if the physical toll became too great. They bound Amora gently to a makeshift altar, not to harm but to protect her from herself during the throes. Jessica hovered nearby, tears streaming, clutching a rosary as if it were her lifeline. From the start, Astaroth resisted with a ferocity that tested everyone's resolve. As Father Rossi intoned the prayers calling upon the archangels, Invoking the name of Christ, the child's body contorted, levitating slightly off the surface, a sight that would shake even the staunchest believer. Through Amora's mouth came a torrent of ancient languages, curses mixed with twisted scriptures, mocking the priest's efforts. But it didn't stop there. The demon jumped, shifting its hold to Jessica mid-ritual, causing her to claw at her own chest, drawing blood that seeped through her shirt. The wounds were deep, later requiring stitches and antibiotics to fend off infection that could have turned septic. In that first session, the illusions hit hard. Astaroth conjured visions of fire engulfing the church, flames licking at the walls, though no heat followed. Dr. Vargas, trying to administer a sedative to calm Jessica, got caught in the crossfire of this hallucination, her face blistering as if burned, the pain so intense it dropped her into a coma-like state for hours. She woke disoriented, her skin raw and peeling, a permanent reminder of the spiritual warfare at play. Father Rossi pressed on, sprinkling holy water that sizzled on contact with the possessed, drawing guttural screams that echoed through the empty pews. But here's where the layers peeled back, revealing the depth of this entity's cunning. Midway through the second session, Astaroth began to spill secrets, not just its own backstory of rebellion against the divine order, but personal ones tied to those in the room. It laughed through Jessica's voice, recounting how it had whispered to Victor Hale years earlier in 2006, urging him toward unspeakable acts, the abuse of local children, their small bodies hidden beneath the garage floor to fuel its power. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Father Rossi paused the ritual, contacting authorities discreetly. Sure enough, when police dug up the site later, they unearthed remains tragic evidence that corroborated the demon's taunts, leading to Victor's arrest and eventual death sentence. The evil peaked in that session when Victor, somehow sensing the exposure or perhaps summoned by the entity itself, stormed the abandoned church. Possessed and wild-eyed, he brandished a knife, lunging at Father Rossi mid-prayer. The blade sank deep into the priest's abdomen, piercing intestines in a wound that proved fatal. Rossi collapsed, blood pooling around him, his last words a whispered invocation for protection over the group. It was chaos screams, struggles to subdue Victor, Dr. Vargas rushing to apply pressure, but it was too late. The good father passed right there, his sacrifice a stark reminder of the costs in this line of work. Yet, even in that darkness, light flickered. Dr. Vargas, drawing on her medical knowledge and unshakable resolve, pieced together a crucial twist. Astaroth hadn't just latched on to Amora or Jessica, it had embedded itself in Blaine from the very beginning, exploiting his criminal past as a weak point, using him as a hidden vessel to orchestrate the violence. This meant a dual exorcism was needed, extending the ritual across multiple grueling sessions, each one pushing the survivors to their limits. Over the next 11 nights, the battles raged on, filled with more manifestations, objects hurling through the air, voices mimicking lost loved ones to sow despair, and physical assaults that left bruises and fractures. Sophie, still aiding despite her injury, faced her own trial when Astaroth targeted her, causing a vision that led to a car accident on her way home one evening, tires screeching, metal crumpling, resulting in partial paralysis that changed her life forever. But through it all, faith held the line. Prayers intensified, relics were brought in, and slowly, painstakingly, the demon's grip weakened. As we approach the resolution of this harrowing tale, remember, friends, these encounters aren't about glorifying the darkness, but highlighting the triumph of good. The devil may rage, but he cannot prevail against unwavering belief. Hold tight as we reveal how it all ended and the lingering shadows that followed. With the exorcism's grueling sessions behind them, the survivors emerged, battered but alive, though the scars, both seen and unseen, would linger like echoes in an empty cathedral. Astaroth had been expelled, forced back into the abyss through the power of prayer, the sacraments, and the unyielding will of those who stood against it. But victory in these spiritual wars is never clean. It's marked by loss, by the remnants of darkness that cling to the soul. Let me walk you through the aftermath, friends, because it's in these moments that we see the true cost of dabbling with forces beyond our understanding and the redemptive grace that can follow. Jessica Johnson, that poor woman caught in the whirlwind, faced the harsh light of earthly justice first. The authorities, reviewing the evidence from Amora's tragic death, charged her with complicity, arguing that even if demonic influence played a role, her failure to seek help sooner made her accountable. In court, she pleaded her case through tears, describing how the entity had clouded her judgment, whispering lies that made violence seem like salvation. But the jury, grounded in the material world, saw only neglect and abuse. She was sentenced to prison time, a stretch that broke her spirit further. Isolated in her cell, the whispers returned not from Astaroth, but from her own guilt-ridden mind, replaying the horrors night after night. By 2012, overwhelmed, she took her own life, a final act that underscored how the demon's touch can outlast its presence. It's a reminder, as I've often said in my lectures, that evil preys on our weaknesses, turning them into weapons against ourselves. Blaine Miller's fate was no less grim. Surviving his injuries with permanent disabilities, a spine that never fully mended, leaving him reliant on a wheelchair, he was convicted on multiple counts, including manslaughter in Amora's death and assault on Jessica. His defense hinged on possession, claiming Astaroth had amplified his darker impulses, but the judge saw a pattern from his prior record, deeming him a perpetual threat. Sentenced to life without parole, Blaine became a shadow of himself in the penitentiary system, haunted by visions that prison chaplains attributed to untreated trauma. In my experience with similar cases, I've seen how demons exploit past sins, burrowing deep until exorcism unearths them. Blaine's story warns us, unrepented evil invites greater darkness, and without true contrition, healing remains elusive. Dr. Elena Vargas, the psychiatrist who bridged science and faith, carried forward with a resilience that inspires me to this day. Her burns from the illusory flames left faint scars on her face, but the deeper wounds were psychological nightmares of fire and failure that woke her in cold sweats. Yet, she channeled that pain into purpose, continuing her practice at Texas Health Harris Methodist with a newfound emphasis on the spiritual dimensions of mental health. She authored reports and papers, anonymized of course, detailing the case to educate her peers, how symptoms mimicking psychosis could stem from otherworldly sources, urging collaboration between clergy and clinicians. In one seminar I attended years later, she spoke of it eloquently, stressing that ignoring the supernatural risks, misdiagnosing the soul's cries for help. Her work became a beacon, helping countless others navigate similar torments. Victor Hale, the unwitting or perhaps willing tool in Astaroth's arsenal, met justice swiftly. The unearthed remains under the garage sealed his doom. Evidence of his 2006 crimes, the abuse and concealment of innocent children, all confessed under interrogation as if the demon's expulsion had loosened his tongue. Tried for murder and more, he received the death penalty, a sentence carried out in the Texas way. But even in his final appeals, he ranted about voices commanding him, a testament to how deeply the entity had woven into his life. It's chilling to think how one, summoning decades prior, could ripple outward, ensnaring unrelated souls in its web. The house on Hemphill Street stood as a silent sentinel to the ordeal, abandoned after the family shattered. Neighbors avoided it, reporting odd occurrences, flickering lights in empty windows, cold spots on warm days, faint growls carried on the wind. By 2011, it met a mysterious end, a fire that erupted without clear cause, reducing it to ashes overnight. Arson investigators found no accelerants, no faulty wiring. Some whispered it was Astaroth's final spike, erasing its foothold. The lot sat vacant for years, a patch of scorched earth where nothing grew, as if cursed. But the legacy extended beyond those directly involved. In the broader community, reports trickled in through 2010, unexplained madness in nearby homes, scholars at local universities plagued by suicidal thoughts after delving into occult texts, echoing Astaroth's historical playbook. Church records in Fort Worth noted a spike in possession inquiries, prompting more training for exorcists like myself. I've reviewed those diocesan files, seen patterns that match what I've encountered in Indiana. Demons don't vanish. They lurk, waiting for the next open door, be it curiosity or despair. Sophie Ramirez, the nurse whose kindness drew her into the fray, adapted to her partial paralysis with grace, though it ended her hospital shifts. She turned to advocacy, volunteering at support groups for trauma survivors, sharing her story in hushed tones to warn against the occult. Her faith deepened, attending Mass daily, finding solace in the sacraments that had saved her from worse. In conversations I've had with similar witnesses, they often describe a profound shift from fear to fortitude, recognizing that suffering, when offered up, can become a path to holiness. This tale, drawn from court transcripts and ecclesiastical reports I've studied, illustrates the eternal struggle between light and shadow. Astaroth, with its guise of forbidden wisdom, lured in the vulnerable Rita with her rituals, Jessica with her accidental incantation, Blaine and Victor with their sins, while the righteous, like Father Rossi, Dr. Vargas and Sophie, stood firm, paying dearly but prevailing through divine aid. Rossi's death in particular haunts me, a holy man cut down in service, much like martyrs of old. Yet, his sacrifice wasn't in vain. It galvanized the fight, reminding us that Christ's authority over evil is absolute. As we near the close of this account, consider the broader lesson. In our modern world, with its temptations toward the esoteric tarot cards, spirit boards, ancient grimoires, we must remain vigilant. I've performed over 50 exorcisms as the designated exorcist for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis since 2005. And each one reinforces that the devil is real, active, seeking whom he may devour. But fear not, arm yourself with prayer, the Eucharist, confession. These are our shields. The story of Fort Worth isn't just history, it's a cautionary beacon, urging us to choose light over curiosity's abyss. Friends, let's pause here to reflect before we wrap up with the enduring echoes that still resonate today. In the face of such evil, our hope lies not in human strength, but in the one who conquered death itself. Stay rooted in that truth. Now, as we delve deeper into the ripples that this encounter sent through the world beyond Fort Worth, it's worth reflecting on how such events don't end with the exorcism they echo, influencing lives and communities in subtle, often unseen ways. I've seen this pattern in my own ministry, where one deliverance uncovers threads leading to others, like pulling at a loose string in a vast tapestry of spiritual warfare. In the years following 2009, the diocese in Texas ramped up its vigilance, training more priests in the rites of exorcism, drawing from the lessons of Father Rossi's sacrifice. His notes, preserved in church archives, detailed the entity's tactics, how Astaroth preyed on intellectual pride, offering glimpses of hidden truths that led to ruin, much like it did to those alchemists and monks of old. Clergy across the state began incorporating these insights into homilies, warning parishioners against the allure of New Age practices or online occult forums that masquerade as harmless curiosity. Consider the broader impact on the medical community, Doctor. Vargas's reports didn't just gather dust. They sparked dialogues at conferences where psychiatrists and theologians debated the intersection of mental illness and demonic oppression. I recall attending a panel in Indianapolis around 2015 where a colleague shared a similar case. A professor obsessed with ancient texts, driven to paranoia by voices promising forbidden equations that solved unsolvable problems, only to unravel his sanity. Vargas's work provided a framework emphasizing diagnostic tools that included spiritual assessments, questions about exposure to rituals, unexplained phenomena, or family histories tied to the occult. It saved lives, steering patients toward holistic care rather than solely medication, which often masks symptoms without addressing the root. In the neighborhoods around Hemphill Street, the changes were more tangible, more haunting. Families who once dismissed the growls as stray animals now crossed themselves, passing the vacant lot. By 2012, a local prayer group formed, holding vigils to consecrate the ground, sprinkling holy water where the house once stood. Yet anomalies persisted. A jogger in 2013 reported a sudden heat wave on a cool morning, blistering his skin as if from an invisible flame. A child playing nearby spoke in tongues, reciting Latin phrases about fallen angels, sending his parents scrambling to the nearest parish. These weren't isolated. Police logs noted an uptick in domestic disturbances, self-harm incidents, and even a cluster of suicides among history buffs who'd researched the Goetia online. It was as if Astaroth, though banished, had left spores, residual energies waiting for fertile soil. This ties into a truth I've emphasized in my book and interviews. Demons are opportunistic, exploiting cultural shifts towards secularism where faith wanes and skepticism reigns. In our tech-driven age, with apps summoning spirits or AI mimicking ancient oracles, the risks multiply. I remember a case from my own archdiocese, a young engineer in 2010, tinkering with virtual reality simulations of occult rites for a game, only to invite something real that manifested as code glitches, turning into auditory hallucinations, whispering formulas that drove him to isolation. It took months of sessions to free him, reinforcing that what starts as entertainment can end in bondage. Sophie Ramirez's journey post-accident offers a glimmer of hope amid the gloom. Wheelchair-bound but unbroken, she authored a memoir self-published at first, then picked up by a Catholic press detailing her role as a witness, framing her paralysis as a thorn in the flesh, like St. Paul's, a reminder to rely on grace. She spoke at retreats, her voice steady, recounting how the entity's illusions during the ritual mimicked her deepest fears: abandonment, failure as a healer. Yet, through physical therapy and spiritual direction, she founded a ministry for the disabled, blending medical support with prayer circles. Her story reached me through mutual contacts. We corresponded, sharing strategies for post-exorcism care, emphasizing community as a bulwark against relapse. Victor's execution in 2014 closed one chapter, but opened questions about systemic evil. Prison ministers reported his final days filled with remorse, confessing not just his crimes, but how Astaroth had amplified generational curses, his family tree riddled with abuse, addiction, tracing back to occult dabblings in the 1980s. It highlighted a cycle: unhealed wounds, inviting demonic footholds, perpetuating harm across lineages. In my training sessions for new exorcists, I stress generational deliverance prayers, breaking those chains through confession and renunciation, preventing echoes like those in Fort Worth from repeating. Even Blaine, from behind bars, became an unwitting teacher. Inmates who shared his block spoke of his ramblings, nights where he'd scream about knowledge that kills, drawing crude symbols on cell walls the guards erased hastily. A chaplain I know visited him, offering sacraments that brought fleeting peace, but the damage was deep. Chronic pain from his injuries, compounded by spectral visitations, testing the limits of redemption. It underscores that while demons can be cast out, human consequences endure, calling for ongoing pastoral care. As for Jessica's tragic end, it spurred advocacy within women's prisons, with groups pushing for spiritual counseling programs, recognizing possession as a mitigating factor in mental health evaluations. Her suicide note leaked briefly before suppression, pleaded for forgiveness, claiming lingering whispers urged her hand, a final taunt from the abyss. These threads weave a narrative not of defeat, but of resilience. The Fort Worth case, documented in veiled terms within Vatican-approved texts, serves as a case study for exorcists worldwide, including my consultations with the International Association of Exorcists. Founded in the 1990s, it gathers us to share experiences, refining rites against entities like Astaroth who adapt to modern lures, misinformation, floods, conspiracy theories promising secret truths that fracture societies. Friends, as we approach the final reflections on this saga, let's remember that awareness is our first defense. I fielded calls from across the globe, parents worried about children's online explorations, professionals battling unexplained compulsions, all echoing this story's warnings. The devil doesn't need grand rituals. A misplaced curiosity suffices. But armed with faith, scripture, and the church's authority, we stand firm. Hold that close as we conclude with the timeless hope that light always overcomes. Drawing to a close on this profound narrative, let's turn our gaze to the universal truths it unveils, truths that transcend the borders of Texas and speak to every soul navigating this vale of tears. In my decades serving as a priest, ordained back in 1991 and appointed exorcist for Indianapolis in 2005, I've witnessed how stories like this one serve as lighthouses, guiding us away from treacherous shores. Astaroth's saga isn't unique. It's an archetype of demonic strategy, enticing with promises of power or insight, only to ensnare and destroy. But embedded within is the counter-narrative, the resilience of the human spirit, fortified by divine grace, capable of reclaiming even the most lost ground. Reflect for a moment on the preventive measures we can all adopt, lessons distilled from cases I've handled and those shared among exorcists globally. First, cultivate discernment in what we consume, be it books, media, or online content. That dusty tome Jessica found wasn't innocuous. It was a vector for evil, much like apps today that gamify seances or horoscopes that subtly erode faith. I advise families to bless their homes regularly, using holy water and prayers of protection, creating a spiritual barrier against intrusion. In my parish work, I've seen simple acts like these avert crises, turning potential footholds into fortresses of peace. Moreover, foster community isolation breeds vulnerability. Jessica's descent deepened in solitude. Had she confided earlier in a trusted spiritual advisor, the outcome might have differed. Encourage open dialogues in your circles about faith struggles, mental health, and the supernatural. Support groups, like those Sophie pioneered, provide safe spaces where experiences are validated, not dismissed. I've facilitated similar forums where survivors share testimonies, demystifying possession and emphasizing that it's rare, often mimicking psychological issues, yet real when it strikes. Education plays a pivotal role too. Since this case, resources have proliferated. Books like my own Exorcism, The Battle Against Satan and His Demons, published in 2021, outline signs of oppression, unexplained aversions to sacred objects, knowledge of hidden facts, physical anomalies, and steps to seek help through the church. Dioceses now offer workshops, training laity to recognize when to refer cases to professionals. Imagine if Rita Hale had access to such knowledge. Her rituals might never have begun. Today, with the rise of social media, misinformation spreads fast, viral challenges, invoking spirits under guises of fun. Counter this by promoting authentic catechesis, grounding youth in Scripture where Christ commands demons with authority. On a personal level, nurture virtues that repel darkness, humility over pride, charity over selfishness, perseverance in prayer. Astaroth thrived on intellectual arrogance, twisting knowledge into madness. Combat this with the wisdom of saints, Ignatius of Loyola's discernment of spirits, distinguishing divine promptings from deceptive ones. In confessions, I've heard patterns emerge, small compromises leading to larger breaches, like Blaine's unaddressed past opening doors. Regular sacraments, Eucharist fortifying the soul, reconciliation, cleansing it act as antidotes, as potent as any rite. Looking outward, the case influenced policy subtly. Advocacy from figures like Dr. Vargas pushed for integrated care models, where hospitals collaborate with clergy for holistic treatment. In 2018, I spoke at a medical ethics conference on this. citing anonymized examples where misdiagnosed possessions led to tragedy. Progress is slow, but promising. Some states now include spiritual assessments and crisis interventions, potentially saving lives like Amora's. The environmental aftermath in Fort Worth evolved too. By 2015, the lot was redeveloped into a community garden, blessed by local bishops, symbolizing renewal from ashes. Yet, whispers of anomalies faded only gradually. A 2016 report noted a final spike in disturbances quelled by mass exorcisms of the area. It illustrates that places like people can bear spiritual imprints, requiring collective prayer to heal. In wrapping this tale, consider the hope it ignites. Despite losses, Rossi martyred, Jessica lost, others scarred, good triumphed. Astaroth fled before Christ's name, affirming the church's ancient promise. Gates of hell shall not prevail. This isn't fear-mongering, it's empowerment. If shadows loom in your life, reach out to a priest, a counselor, a friend. You're not alone. The communion of saints intercedes. Angels guard. Friends, thank you for journeying through this account with me. May it strengthen your faith, sharpen your vigilance, and draw you closer to the light. In the words of Scripture, be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. But remember, the Lion of Judah has already won. God bless you all.